The titanium handle of the security vault felt like ice against my shaking fingertips. 27 years of being called the family screw-up, the daughter who couldn't keep a job, couldn't finish anything, couldn't be trusted with pocket change, the one who would inherit nothing but disappointment and debt. Yet here I stood, in the basement of Meridian Trust Bank, watching a blue light scan my thumbprint like it had been programmed to recognize me since birth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside that vault sat government bonds worth exactly $247 million. Bonds that legally belonged to me. Bonds that proved everything my family had whispered about me behind closed doors was not just wrong, but catastrophically, painfully wrong. My name is Catherine Rivers, and this is the story of how my family spent 3 decades convincing me I was worthless, only to discover that my great-aunt had left me a fortune so vast it would reshape everything. But getting to that vault required me to survive 27 years of psychological warfare, uncover a web of lies that stretched back generations, and finally understand that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones working hardest to keep you small. The morning this all began, I was elbow-deep in industrial bleach and self-doubt. Riverside Community Hospital looked different at 4:30 in the morning when the hallways echoed with nothing but the squeak of my cartwheels and the distant hum of life support machines. Most people my age were probably getting their first cup of coffee or checking social media from warm beds. Me? I was sanitizing hospital rooms and emptying biohazard containers, trying to scrape together enough money to keep my studio apartment and maybe, if I was lucky, afford groceries that weren't past their expiration date. 27 years old and still chasing stability that seemed to slip through my fingers like water. My mother, Patricia Rivers, had perfected the art of the disappointed sigh whenever anyone asked about my career prospects. It was this specific sound that managed to convey both pity and frustration in a single exhale, usually followed by some variation of, "Catherine still finding herself." My father, Robert, preferred the direct approach. "Some people are late bloomers," he'd say, with the tone of someone who'd given up expecting any blooms at all. "And some people just aren't meant for traditional success." My sister Amanda had taken a different route entirely. She'd simply stopped acknowledging my existence unless absolutely necessary. Amanda Rivers Hamilton, successful real estate attorney, mother of 2, owner of a colonial house in Willowbrook Heights with a 3-car garage and annual family trips to the Hamptons. When forced to mention me at social gatherings, she described me as still figuring things out, with a smile that looked sympathetic but felt like a knife. They weren't entirely wrong to write me off, I thought, as I wheeled my cart past the pediatric wing. My work history looked like a disaster documentary. 6 months at Morrison's department store before getting fired for attitude issues when I questioned why we were throwing away perfectly good merchandise. 4 months at Techno Solutions before they decided I wasn't a cultural fit after I suggested their billing practices might be borderline fraudulent. 2 years at Preston Elementary before budget cuts eliminated my teaching assistant position, along with my faith that hard work meant job security. The pattern was always the same. I'd start with enthusiasm, work harder than anyone else, notice problems that needed solving, speak up about issues that others ignored, and then find myself labeled as difficult, negative, or not a team player. My family saw these job losses as confirmation of their long-held belief that I lacked the basic social skills necessary for professional success. "Catherine has strong opinions," my mother would explain to relatives who asked why I wasn't settling down like Amanda. "She hasn't learned that sometimes keeping your thoughts to yourself is more important than being right." "He's idealistic," my father would add. "The real world doesn't reward people who rock the boat." What they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I was trying to make things better. When I saw Morrison's throwing away winter coats while homeless people froze outside, I couldn't just stay quiet. When Techno Solutions was overcharging elderly clients for services they didn't need, I couldn't pretend not to notice. When Preston Elementary was cutting art programs while administrators got raises, I couldn't smile and nod like everything was fine. But fighting for what's right doesn't pay rent. Speaking truth to power doesn't put food on the table, and pointing out systemic problems doesn't make you popular at family dinners where everyone wants to discuss safe topics, like weather and television shows. So here I was, sanitizing hospital rooms at dawn, invisible to the doctors and nurses who saved lives while I cleaned up the aftermath. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. And after years of being told I was unemployable, having any job felt like a small victory, even if my family treated it as further evidence of my inability to achieve anything meaningful.
The irony wasn't lost on me that I was cleaning the rooms where people fought for their lives while my own family had long since given up fighting for mine. They'd written me off as a cautionary tale, the daughter who proved that some people just aren't cut out for success, no matter how many opportunities they're given. I had just finished the ICU when my phone buzzed with a text message that would change everything. The name on the screen made me pause. Evelyn Cross, a family friend I hadn't heard from in almost a decade. Evelyn had been my great-aunt Millicent's closest companion, a sharp-minded woman in her 70s who lived in the historic district of Thornfield and had always treated me with more respect than my own relatives. "Catherine, I need to see you today. It's about your great-aunt Millicent. There are things about her estate that you need to know immediately. Can you come to my house this afternoon? It's urgent." Great-aunt Millicent had died 8 months earlier at the age of 93. The family had barely mentioned her passing, treating it as a minor footnote to their busy lives. According to my parents, Millicent had been the eccentric old woman who'd never married, never had children, and had spent her final decades hoarding antiques in a crumbling Victorian house that probably cost more to maintain than it was worth. "Poor Millicent never learned how to manage money," my mother had said after the funeral. "That house was falling apart around her ears, but she was too stubborn to sell it and move somewhere sensible." "She lived in the past," my father had added, always talking about the family's glory days, as if any of that mattered in the modern world. But I remembered Millicent differently. During the few times I'd visited her house as a child, she'd treated me like someone worth listening to. She'd asked me about my thoughts, my dreams, my observations about the world. She'd shown me photo albums filled with pictures of relatives I'd never heard of, told me stories about family history that no one else seemed to remember or care about. "You have your great-great-grandfather's eyes," she told me once, pointing to a sepia photograph of a stern-looking man in a Victorian-era suit. "He was a difficult man, but a brilliant one. He saw things others missed, spoke truths others wouldn't say. People called him troublesome, but he was usually right." At the time, I thought she was just being kind to an awkward child who didn't fit in anywhere else. Now, staring at Evelyn's text message in the fluorescent lighting of a hospital hallway, I wondered if those conversations had meant more than I'd realized. I finished my shift in a daze, my mind spinning with questions about what Evelyn might want to discuss. Millicent's estate had been settled months ago, or so I'd assumed. My parents had never mentioned inheriting anything, and they certainly hadn't suggested that I might be entitled to some portion of whatever she'd left behind. But as I drove across Thornfield toward Evelyn's address, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to learn something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my great-aunt, and my place in a story much larger than I'd ever imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Evelyn Cross lived in one of those grand Victorian houses that made Thornfield's historic district look like a movie set. Climbing ivy covered the brick exterior, and stained glass windows caught the afternoon light in ways that painted rainbow patterns across the wraparound porch. It was the kind of house that whispered old money and family legacy, everything my family claimed to value but had somehow never achieved. I parked my 15-year-old Honda Civic between a gleaming Mercedes and a restored 1960s Jaguar, feeling like I was announcing my inadequacy to the entire neighborhood. My work uniform still smelled faintly of disinfectant, and I had exactly 12 minutes to shower and change into the one decent outfit I owned: black slacks with a small bleach stain near the hem and a navy blouse that had seen better days.
Evelyn answered the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. At 74, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's business affairs. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a tailored cream-colored dress that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. "Catherine, I need to see you today. It's about your great-aunt Millicent. There are things about her estate that you need to know immediately. Can you come to my house this afternoon? It's urgent." I had no idea what to expect, but I can't deny that I was intrigued and a bit nervous to find out why Evelyn wanted to see me, especially after all this time since Millicent's death. I wondered what new information she might have. What possible connection would it have to my already complicated family history? Little did I know that this meeting would change my perspective on everything I know about my family and my life as a whole, and set me on a journey that would reveal a hidden legacy that I had never imagined.
Evelyn poured tea into delicate china cups painted with tiny blue flowers. Everything about her movements was precise, deliberate, as if she'd been performing these rituals for decades. "Catherine, what did your family tell you about Millicent's death?" The question caught me off guard. That she died peacefully in her sleep, that she'd been declining for months, that the funeral would be small and private. And her estate? I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. They said she didn't have much, that maintaining that old house had eaten up most of her savings, that there were some family heirlooms to be distributed, but nothing of significant value. Evelyn set down her teacup with a sharp clink that seemed louder than it should have been. "Catherine, your family lied to you. About everything." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't see. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Millicent Harper was one of the wealthiest women in 3 counties. I mean that her estate was worth well over $300 million. And I mean that she left specific instructions about how that money should be distributed, instructions that your parents have been actively concealing from you for 8 months. I stared at Evelyn, convinced I'd misheard her. $300 million? The number was so large it seemed fictional, like something from a movie about billionaire dynasties and family conspiracies. "That's impossible," I said finally. "Millicent lived in that falling-apart house. She drove a car that was older than I am. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation and bought her groceries with coupons. She lived modestly by choice, not necessity. Millicent inherited significant wealth from her father's shipping business, invested it wisely over 7 decades, and accumulated a fortune that would dwarf most corporate executives' net worth. She chose to live simply because she believed that visible wealth corrupted character and attracted the wrong kind of attention." Evelyn stood and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a manila folder thick enough to contain a novel. "These are copies of documents from Millicent's estate planning, documents that your parents received 8 months ago but chose not to share with you." I opened the folder with trembling hands. The first page was a letter addressed to the Harper family, on letterhead from Blackthorne, Ashford & Associates, estate planning attorneys. I recognized my father's signature at the bottom, acknowledging receipt of the documents. The second page made my vision blur. "Last Will and Testament of Millicent Elizabeth Harper" was printed across the top in formal legal font. Below that, in language dense with legal terminology, was a document that would change my understanding of everything. "I don't understand all the legal language," I admitted, looking up at Evelyn. "Let me translate." She settled back into her chair with the patient expression of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation. "Millicent left your parents the house and its contents, which are valuable but represent only a small fraction of her total wealth. She left your sister Amanda a trust fund of $5 million to be distributed over 20 years. And she left you the remainder of her estate, investment portfolios, government bonds, real estate holdings, and business interests worth approximately $247 million. The number hit me like cold water. I set down my teacup before I could drop it. "That's not possible. Why would she leave me anything? I barely knew her." "Catherine, you knew her better than anyone else in your family. You were the only one who visited her regularly, who listened to her stories, who showed genuine interest in family history.
You were also the only one who never asked her for money. I thought about those childhood visits to Millicent's house, the hours spent looking through photo albums and listening to stories about relatives I'd never heard of. I'd always assumed she enjoyed the company because she was lonely, not because she was evaluating my character. But why not tell me directly? Why go through my parents? Evelyn's expression grew sad. Because she hoped your family would do the right thing. She hoped they would recognize that you'd been struggling financially and share the information about your inheritance so you could plan for your future. She trusted them to prioritize your well-being over their own interests. Obviously, that didn't happen. Obviously. Instead, they've spent 8 months trying to figure out how to contest the will, how to have you declared mentally incompetent, or how to pressure you into signing over portions of the inheritance to other family members. The betrayal felt physical, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. My parents hadn't just not told me about the inheritance, they'd been actively working against me, treating me like an obstacle to be overcome rather than a daughter to be supported. There's more, Evelyn continued, pulling another document from the folder. Millicent established specific security protocols for accessing the inheritance. She was concerned that family members might try to coerce or manipulate you, so she created safeguards. What kind of safeguards? The bulk of the assets are held in a secure trust managed by Meridian Bank in downtown Thornfield. Access requires biometric identification that was established when you were 16 years old.
Do you remember the summer you spent with Millicent, the year before you started senior year of high school, when she took you to that medical appointment for what she said was a routine health screening? The memory came flooding back. I'd been staying with Millicent for 2 weeks while my parents took Amanda on a college tour of the East Coast. I remembered the appointment, the strange machines, the way a technician had pressed my thumb and index finger against various scanners while explaining that it was part of a new health monitoring system. She was having your biometric data recorded and encrypted for the trust access, Evelyn explained. The inheritance can only be accessed by you using fingerprint identification that matches the records established that summer. She planned this 11 years ago? Millicent was many things, but impulsive wasn't one of them. She'd been watching your family dynamics for decades, making careful observations about character, work ethic, and values. She saw how your parents favored Amanda, how they dismissed your struggles as character flaws, how they failed to recognize your potential. I thought about all the times I'd felt invisible at family gatherings, all the achievements that had gone unnoticed, all the struggles that had been treated as evidence of inadequacy rather than temporary setbacks. Had Millicent been paying attention when no one else was? She also saw something in you that your parents missed: integrity, determination, the willingness to work for what you wanted rather than expecting it to be handed to you. She believed you were the only member of your generation who could be trusted with significant wealth. What am I supposed to do with this information? That's entirely up to you. You can access the inheritance immediately by visiting Meridian Bank and providing biometric identification. You can wait and think about your options, or you can choose to share the information with your family and deal with whatever pressure they apply. I looked down at the legal documents, trying to process the magnitude of what Evelyn was telling me. 24 hours ago, I'd been a hospital cleaner living paycheck to paycheck, convinced that I was the family failure who would never amount to anything. Now I was learning that I was worth nearly $250 million. There's one more thing you should know, Evelyn said, her voice growing serious. Your parents have been asking questions about Millicent's estate. They've contacted the bank, hired a private investigator, and consulted with attorneys about challenging the will. They know there's money involved, even if they don't know the full scope of it. A chill ran down my spine. Do they know about me? They suspect. Your mother called me last week asking about Millicent's personal effects and whether she'd left any family documents that might need to be reviewed. Your father made an appointment with Meridian Bank's estate department, claiming he needed to discuss family financial matters. And Amanda? Amanda has been the most aggressive.
She's already retained an attorney and has been researching legal precedents for contesting wills based on claims of diminished mental capacity or undue influence. The room felt like it was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my place in it, about my own worth, was being demolished and rebuilt in the space of a single conversation. "Evelyn, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you telling me this? Why not let my parents handle it the way Millicent originally intended?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at her perfectly manicured garden. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Because I promised Millicent that if your family failed to do right by you, I would step in and make sure you knew the truth." She was prepared for the possibility that greed would overcome parental love, and she wanted to make sure you had someone in your corner who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "And you think they'll try to intimidate me?" "Catherine, your family has spent your entire life convincing you that you're not capable of success, not worthy of respect, not deserving of the same opportunities they've given your sister. Do you really think they'll suddenly develop faith in your judgment when there's $250 million at stake?" She was right, and I knew it. My parents had never supported my decisions when the stakes were low. They certainly wouldn't trust me to make good choices about an inheritance that dwarfed most people's lifetime earnings. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should remember that Millicent chose you for reasons that had nothing to do with luck or favoritism. She chose you because she believed you had the character to handle wealth responsibly, the wisdom to use resources for good purposes, and the strength to resist pressure from people who don't have your best interests at heart." I gathered the documents and placed them carefully back in the folder. Outside, the sun was setting over Thornfield's historic district, casting long shadows across lawns that had been tended by generations of families who understood legacy and inheritance in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Of course, but Catherine, whatever you decide, remember that you're not the family disappointment they've convinced you that you are. You're the family member who earned the trust of someone who spent her lifetime learning how to distinguish between character and charisma, between substance and surface."
As I drove home through the quiet streets of Thornfield, I realized that my entire identity was about to change. For 27 years, I'd been Catherine Rivers, the daughter who couldn't quite get her life together. Tomorrow, I might be Catherine Rivers, heir to one of the largest private fortunes in the state. The question was whether I was strong enough to handle not just the money, but the family war that would inevitably follow when they discovered what I now knew. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw numbers dancing behind my eyelids. $247 million. $247 million. The amount was so staggering that my mind couldn't process it as real money. It felt like monopoly currency, play money from a childhood game where the stakes were imaginary and the consequences didn't matter. But lying in my studio apartment at 3 a.m., listening to the sound of trucks rumbling past on Highway 9, I knew the consequences were very real. By morning, I would have to decide whether to walk into Meridian Bank and claim an inheritance that would transform me from a struggling hospital cleaner into one of the wealthiest people in the state. More importantly, I would have to decide whether I was ready for the war my family would inevitably declare once they discovered what I'd learned. I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was lying about being ill on the day I discovered I never had to work another day in my life if I chose not to. But I needed time to think, to plan, to understand what Millicent had really left me beyond just money. At 9 a.m., I drove back to Evelyn's house. She answered the door in a rose-colored silk blouse and pearls, looking like she'd been expecting me. "I knew you'd be back," she said, leading me to the same sitting room where my world had been turned upside down less than 24 hours earlier. "You have questions." "I have 1,000 questions, but I need to start with this one. What was Millicent really like? Not the eccentric old woman my family described, but the person who accumulated $250 million and chose to leave it to someone she barely knew."
Evelyn poured fresh coffee from a silver service and settled into her chair with the careful movements of someone who'd performed these rituals countless times. Millicent Harper was the most intelligent person I've ever known, and I've known governors, federal judges, and university presidents. She had a mind that could see patterns where others saw chaos, opportunities where others saw obstacles. Then why did she live like she was poor? Because she understood something that most wealthy people never learn. Money is a tool, not a trophy. Millicent grew up watching her father's shipping fortune attract sycophants, fortune hunters, and people who wanted to use her family's wealth for their own purposes. She decided early in life that she would accumulate resources quietly and use them strategically, rather than displaying them like peacock feathers. Evelyn walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a leather-bound photo album. She returned to her seat and opened it to reveal dozens of black and white photographs spanning several decades. "This is who Millicent really was," she said, pointing to a picture of a young woman in a 1950s business suit standing in front of a construction site. She was 25 years old when she convinced the city council to approve the first integrated housing development in Thornfield. She used her inheritance money to purchase the land and finance the construction. But she did it through shell companies, so no one would know the Harper family was involved. She turned the page to reveal more photographs. Millicent at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a community center, shaking hands with civil rights leaders, standing beside the first female mayor of Thornfield. For 60 years, she quietly funded scholarships, community programs, civil rights organizations, and progressive political candidates. She never sought recognition or publicity. She just identified problems and solved them with strategic applications of money and influence. But why all the secrecy? Because visible philanthropy attracts the wrong kind of attention. Millicent learned early that people treat you differently when they know you have money. They become calculating, manipulative, eager to please in ways that have nothing to do with genuine affection or respect. She preferred to evaluate people based on their character rather than their ability to flatter wealthy benefactors. Evelyn turned to another section of the album, revealing more recent photographs. I recognized some of the faces from charity events and community gatherings I'd seen covered in the local newspaper. Even in her final years, Millicent was funding programs that most people assumed were supported by government grants or corporate donations. The literacy program at the public library, the job training center for displaced workers, the scholarship fund for first-generation college students, all of it was quietly financed by Millicent Harper. And she was watching my family during all of this? She was watching everyone, Catherine. Millicent believed that the best way to evaluate character was to observe how people behaved when they thought no one important was paying attention. She attended community events, shopped at local businesses, participated in neighborhood activities. She watched how people treated service workers, how they responded to those less fortunate than themselves, how they handled conflict and disappointment. Evelyn closed the album and looked directly at me. She paid particular attention to your family because you were her only living relatives. She hoped to find someone who shared her values, someone who could continue her work after she was gone. And she decided that was me? She decided that you were the only one who demonstrated the qualities she considered essential for handling significant wealth: empathy, integrity, and the willingness to work for what you wanted rather than expecting it to be given to you. I thought about the times I'd encountered Millicent around town over the years. I'd always been polite, stopping to chat when our paths crossed at the grocery store or the library. I had helped her carry packages to her car once when she was struggling with heavy bags. I'd listened to her stories about family history without showing the impatience that other relatives displayed during similar conversations. She was testing me, I said, the realization dawning slowly. Not testing, exactly. Observing. Millicent paid attention to how you treated strangers, how you responded to setbacks, how you handled the constant criticism from your parents. She saw someone who maintained dignity under pressure, who worked hard without complaining, who stood up for principles even when it cost you opportunities. What do you mean? Evelyn reached into a side table drawer and pulled out a manila folder I hadn't seen before. Millicent kept detailed records of her observations. She documented incidents that revealed character, both positive and negative, for every family member. She opened the folder to reveal pages of handwritten notes in Millicent's careful script, organized by date and family member. My name appeared frequently, along with observations that made me realize how closely I'd been watched without knowing it. March 15th, 2019, Evelyn read aloud. Catherine intervened when teenage boys were harassing elderly man at bus stop on Maple Street. She could have ignored the situation, but she chose to help someone who couldn't defend himself. No one else stopped to assist. I remember that, I said quietly. Those kids were making fun of Mr. Peterson because he was confused about which bus to take. It wasn't a big deal. To you, perhaps, but Millicent saw it as evidence of character under pressure. She documented dozens of similar incidents over the years. Evelyn flipped through several pages. June 3rd, 2020. Catherine returned wallet to store manager after finding it in parking lot, despite containing over $400 in cash. July 18th, 2021. Catherine worked double shift at hospital to cover for colleague whose child was hospitalized, even though she had plans for her birthday celebration. She was watching me that closely? She was watching all of you that closely. But Catherine, your entries tell a very different story than your parents or your sisters. Evelyn turned to another section of the folder. Robert Rivers, May 2019. Demanded preferential treatment at restaurant when reservation was delayed, spoke rudely to waitstaff, refused to tip when service didn't meet his expectations. She flipped to another page. Patricia Rivers, September 2020. Complained loudly about having to wait in line at the post office, made disparaging comments about other customers, demanded to speak to manager when told she couldn't skip ahead of elderly woman with mobility issues. And Amanda? Amanda's entries focus mainly on her sense of entitlement and her treatment of people she considered beneath her social status. Millicent was particularly disturbed by an incident where Amanda berated a teenage cashier at the country club for a mistake that wasn't the girl's fault. I felt a complex mix of emotions reading these observations. Pride that Millicent had noticed my better moments, but also sadness that my family's character flaws had been so clearly documented by someone who'd hoped to find redeeming qualities in all of us. There's more, Evelyn continued, turning to the back of the folder. Millicent also documented your family's financial attitudes and behaviors. She paid attention to how each of you handled money, debt, and financial responsibility. What did she find? Your parents live beyond their means, maintain significant credit card debt, and make financial decisions based on social status rather than practical considerations. Amanda has never held a job where she was not supported by family connections, and she's accumulated substantial student loan debt that your parents are quietly helping her manage. And me? You've worked continuously since you were 16. Never asked family for financial assistance, lived within your means despite earning low wages, and consistently prioritized paying bills over personal purchases. Millicent saw these patterns as evidence of financial discipline that would serve you well as an inheritance recipient. Evelyn closed the folder and set it aside. Catherine, Millicent didn't choose you randomly or out of pity. She chose you because 30 years of careful observation convinced her that you were the only family member who could be trusted with significant wealth. She believed you would use money as a tool for positive change rather than as a means of personal aggrandizement. But I don't know anything about managing large amounts of money. I don't have experience with investments or business decisions or philanthropy. Neither did Millicent when she inherited her father's estate at 22. The difference is that you have something that can't be taught: integrity and judgment. Everything else can be learned with the help of qualified advisors.
Evelyn stood and walked to her desk, returning with another document. This is a letter Millicent wrote specifically for you, to be delivered after you learned about the inheritance. She wanted you to understand not just what she was giving you, but why. I took the envelope with trembling hands. My name was written across the front in Millicent's distinctive handwriting, along with a date from just 3 weeks before her death. Should I read it now? That's entirely up to you. But Catherine, before you make any decisions about the inheritance, I want you to understand something important. Your family's reaction to this news will reveal their true character in ways that decades of normal interaction never could. People show their real selves when significant money is involved. What do you think they'll do? I think they'll try to convince you that you're not capable of handling such responsibility, that the money should be managed by people with more experience and education. They'll appeal to family loyalty, argue that wealth should be shared equally, and probably threaten legal action if you don't comply with their demands. And if I refuse? Then you'll discover whether your family's love for you is conditional on your willingness to be controlled by them. It's a painful lesson, but an important one. I stared at Millicent's letter, knowing opening it would represent another step toward a confrontation with my family that might destroy our relationships permanently. But I also knew that everything I'd believed about myself, my worth, and my place in the family had been based on incomplete information and deliberate deception. Evelyn, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why are you helping me? What do you get out of standing up to my family and revealing information they obviously wanted to keep secret? She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at her garden, where late autumn flowers were preparing for winter dormancy. Because 40 years ago, Millicent helped me when my own family tried to control an inheritance my grandmother had left me. She showed me that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones most threatened by your independence and success. She taught me that real love supports your growth, even when that growth changes family dynamics in uncomfortable ways. And you think that's what this is about? I think your family has spent 27 years keeping you in a position where you depended on their approval and acceptance. Learning that you're financially independent threatens their ability to control your choices and maintain their position as the successful family members, while you remain the struggling one. Evelyn returned to her chair and looked at me with an expression that combined maternal warmth with steely determination. Catherine, you have an opportunity that most people never get, the chance to discover who you really are when you're not trying to earn approval from people who've already decided you're not worth believing in. Millicent saw your potential and trusted you with the resources to fulfill it. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to honor that faith. I tucked Millicent's letter into my purse, knowing I would read it when I was ready to fully commit to whatever path lay ahead. But sitting in Evelyn's elegant living room, surrounded by evidence of a family history I'd never known existed, I realized that the most important inheritance Millicent had left me wasn't money. It was proof that someone had been paying attention, someone had seen value in me that others had missed, and someone had believed I was worthy of trust and respect. That knowledge was worth more than all the bonds and bank accounts combined, though I suspected I would need both to navigate whatever came next. I drove home from Evelyn's house in a fog of disbelief, Millicent's unopened letter burning like a coal in my purse. The late afternoon traffic moved around me in slow motion as my mind struggled to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. Every familiar landmark along Route 47 looked different now, as if I was seeing my hometown through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged to the same economic reality as everyone else around me.
My studio apartment felt even smaller when I returned. The peeling linoleum and water-stained ceiling suddenly stark reminders of a life I might not have to live much longer. I sat on my secondhand couch and stared at Millicent's letter for 20 minutes before finding the courage to open it. The paper was thick, expensive stationery, embossed with initials I'd never noticed during our conversations. M.E.H. Millicent Elizabeth Harper. Her handwriting was precise despite her advanced age, each word carefully formed as if she had taken extra time to ensure her final message to me would be legible. "My dear Catherine," it began, "if you are reading this letter, it means Evelyn has shared the truth about your inheritance, and you now understand that everything your family told you about my estate was a deliberate deception. I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed, confused, and probably angry. Those emotions are entirely justified." I had to pause reading as tears blurred my vision. Even in death, Millicent understood me better than the people who'd raised me. "I want you to know that choosing you as my heir was not a spontaneous decision made by an elderly woman with questionable judgment. It was the result of careful observation spanning more than a decade. I have watched you demonstrate character, integrity, and resilience in circumstances that revealed the worst qualities in other family members."
The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing specific incidents Millicent had witnessed or learned about through her network of community connections. She'd note about every job I'd lost for standing up to unethical practices. She'd tracked my financial struggles and my refusal to ask family for help. She'd even known about the time I'd anonymously paid the overdue electric bill for an elderly neighbor who was too proud to accept charity directly. "Catherine, you have spent your entire adult life being told that your struggles prove your inadequacy. I want you to understand that your struggles have actually proven your strength. Every setback you faced has been an opportunity to demonstrate resilience. Every criticism you've endured has been a test of your ability to maintain dignity under pressure. Every time you've chosen principle over convenience, you've shown the kind of character that money cannot buy, but that money desperately needs to guide it." She described her own early years managing inherited wealth, the mistakes she'd made, the lessons she'd learned about the responsibility that came with significant resources. She explained her philosophy of strategic philanthropy, her belief that wealth should be used to solve problems rather than accumulate possessions. "I am not leaving you this inheritance because I feel sorry for you," she wrote. "I am leaving it to you because I believe you are the only family member capable of using it wisely. You understand struggle in ways that will make you compassionate toward others who struggle. You understand the value of hard work in ways that will make you selective about the causes and people you choose to support. Most importantly, you understand that character matters more than comfort, a lesson that cannot be taught to someone who has never been tested." The final paragraph of her letter made me cry harder than I had since childhood. "Catherine, I know your family will pressure you to share this inheritance, and they will make you feel selfish for honoring my wishes. Please remember that sharing unearned wealth with people who have not developed the character to handle it responsibly is not generosity. It is enabling destructive behavior. I have given your parents and your sister exactly what I believed they could handle responsibly. I have given you everything else because I believe you can handle the responsibility of stewarding resources that could change countless lives if used wisely." She signed the letter, "With love and absolute faith in your future, Millicent," and included a postscript that made me laugh despite my tears. "P.S. The safe deposit box at Meridian Bank contains additional documents that will help you understand the full scope of your inheritance. The banker's name is Harrison Thorne, and he has been expecting your visit for quite some time." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, then sat in my tiny apartment trying to absorb the reality that someone had believed in me so completely that they'd entrusted me with a fortune. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Amanda's name appeared on the caller ID. "Catherine, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "Can you come to Mom and Dad's house tonight? There's a family matter we need to discuss." My stomach clenched. What kind of family matter? "It's about Aunt Millicent's estate. We've learned some things that affect the whole family, and we need to make some decisions together. The conversation I'd been dreading was happening sooner than I had expected. What kinds of things? Just come over tonight around 7. We'll explain everything then. Amanda's voice had the crisp, professional tone she used when she was trying to control a situation. And Catherine, this is important. Don't discuss this with anyone else until we've had a chance to talk as a family. After she hung up, I realized they must have learned something about the inheritance, possibly through their private investigator or their inquiries at the bank. They knew enough to be concerned, but probably not enough to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. I had 3 hours to decide how to handle the confrontation. I could pretend ignorance and let them reveal what they knew, hoping to understand their strategy. I could tell them I already knew about the inheritance and try to negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution. Or I could take Evelyn's advice and establish my independence by accessing the inheritance before they could pressure me into compromising. The smart move, I realized, was to visit Meridian Bank immediately. Once I'd officially claimed the inheritance, I would be dealing with my family from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. They could pressure and manipulate someone they perceived as financially dependent on their goodwill, but they couldn't control someone who had independent resources and legal standing. Meridian Bank occupied a stately brick building in downtown Thornfield that had served the community for a century. The marble floors and brass fixtures suggested old money conservatism and institutional stability. I approached the customer service desk with sweaty palms and a racing heart, still half convinced this was all an elaborate mistake or cruel joke. I need to speak with Harrison Thorne about accessing a safe deposit box, I told the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and kind eyes. Of course, Mr. Thorne has been expecting you, Miss Rivers. Let me escort you to his office. The fact that she knew my name without me providing it confirmed that Millicent's planning had been even more thorough than I had realized. Harrison Thorne's office was exactly what I'd expected: wood-paneled walls, leather-bound books, and the kind of solid mahogany furniture that suggested generations of satisfied clients.
Thorne himself was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to managing significant wealth. He stood when I entered and extended his hand with a warm smile. "Ms. Rivers, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Millicent spoke of you often and always with great affection." "She did?" "Oh yes, she was quite proud of you, though she was careful never to let that pride influence her estate planning decisions. Please, have a seat. I imagine you have questions." "I have 1,000 questions, but I suppose the most important one is whether this is really happening. Am I actually inheriting $247 million, or is this some kind of misunderstanding?" Thorne chuckled and pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer. "It's really happening, Ms. Rivers. In fact, the current value of your inheritance is slightly higher than the figure you mentioned. The markets have been favorable over the past 8 months, and Millicent's investment portfolio has continued to grow." He opened the folder to reveal documents that made my earlier shock seem insignificant: account statements, bond certificates, stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and business interests that painted a picture of wealth so vast I couldn't comprehend it. The liquid assets alone, stocks, bonds, and cash equivalents, total approximately $198 million, Thorne explained, pointing to various statements. The real estate holdings, including commercial properties in 3 states and residential investments, add another $31 million. Business interests and intellectual property rights contribute an additional $22 million. "That's $251 million, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Correct. And that figure will continue to grow through dividends, interest, and appreciation. Millicent was a very sophisticated investor who understood the power of compound growth over time." Thorne walked me through the details of accessing the inheritance, explaining the biometric security protocols, the trust structure, and the legal protections Millicent had established. The process was more complex than simply claiming the money. It involved assuming control of investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business interests that required ongoing management.
There's one more thing you should know, Thorne said as we concluded our meeting. Your family have been making inquiries about this account. Your father requested information about estate proceedings, and your sister has consulted with attorneys about potential challenges to the will. What did you tell them? Nothing that violated client confidentiality, but enough to confirm that there are significant assets involved. I suspect they know more than they have revealed to you, which is why I'm glad you came in today. Once you officially claim the inheritance, their ability to challenge your legal standing becomes much more limited. The biometric scanner was more sophisticated than I had expected, requiring fingerprint identification from both thumbs plus a retinal scan that matched records established during that long-ago visit with Millicent. When the final verification completed and the system acknowledged my identity, I felt a fundamental shift in my understanding of who I was and what my life could become. Congratulations, Miss Rivers. You are now one of the wealthiest individuals in the state. I hope you'll allow our bank to continue managing these assets as we did for Millicent. What happens now? Now you decide how you want to structure your financial life going forward. You can maintain the existing investment strategy, which has been quite successful, or you can work with our advisory team to develop new approaches. You can begin accessing funds immediately for personal needs, or you can leave everything invested and live off the dividends and interest. And my family? Your family has no legal claim to these assets, but I suspect they will attempt to convince you otherwise. Be prepared for significant pressure, Ms. Rivers. In my experience, large inheritances reveal family dynamics that might otherwise remain hidden. As I left Meridian Bank with legal documents proving my ownership of assets worth more than most people's lifetime earnings, I realized that the easy part was over. The difficult part, dealing with my family's reaction, was about to begin. I had 2 hours before the family meeting at my parents' house. 2 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would either destroy my relationships with the people who'd raised me or establish new boundaries based on honesty and mutual respect. Either way, Catherine Rivers, the struggling hospital cleaner, was gone forever. The question was, who Catherine Rivers, the heiress, would choose to become. The drive to my parents' house felt like traveling to my own execution. Every familiar turn brought me closer to a confrontation that would either establish my independence or destroy the last remnants of family relationships I'd been clinging to despite years of disappointment and dismissal. The legal documents from Meridian Bank sat in my purse like evidence of a crime I'd committed against people who'd never truly believed in my innocence anyway. The house on Elmwood Drive looked exactly the same as always, white colonial with black shutters, meticulously maintained lawn, and the kind of aggressive suburban perfection that announced to neighbors that the Rivers family had their act together. Amanda's silver Lexus was parked in the driveway next to Dad's practical Buick, and I could see lights on in the living room where family meetings had been held for as long as I can remember. I sat in my car for 5 minutes, gathering courage and trying to prepare for whatever strategy they'd developed. The private investigator they'd hired had obviously uncovered enough information to alarm them, but I doubt they knew the full scope of what they were dealing with. More likely, they'd learned that Millicent had left significant assets to family members and were planning to pressure me into agreeing to some kind of redistribution before I fully understood my legal rights.
The front door opened before I could knock, and Mom stood there with the kind of forced smile she used when she was trying to manage a difficult situation. At 58, Patricia Rivers still maintained the carefully controlled appearance of someone who'd spent decades presenting herself as the mother of successful children, even when one of those children consistently failed to meet expectations. "Catherine, thank you for coming," she said, embracing me with the brief, efficient hug she'd perfected for occasions when physical affection was socially required but emotionally complicated. "Your father and Amanda are waiting in the living room." The scene inside was clearly orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. Dad sat in his favorite recliner, wearing the navy suit he reserved for important business meetings. Amanda occupied the couch, surrounded by manila folders and legal documents spread across the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom.
Mom gestured toward the remaining chair, positioning me across from the other 3 family members in what felt like an interrogation setup. "Catherine, we need to discuss some developments regarding Aunt Millicent's estate," Dad began, using the measured tone he employed when he wanted to sound reasonable and authoritative. "We've learned some things that affect all of us, and we need to make some family decisions about how to proceed." "What kinds of things?" I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. Amanda leaned forward, assuming her lawyer persona with practiced ease. "Our investigation has revealed that Millicent's estate is significantly larger than we were initially told. The house and personal effects we inherited represent only a small fraction of her total assets." "Investigation?" "We hired a private investigator to look into Millicent's financial records," Mom said, her voice carrying a note of defensiveness. "We had reasons to believe that the estate settlement wasn't handled properly, that there might be assets that weren't disclosed during probate proceedings." Dad opened one of the folders and pulled out several documents. "What we discovered is that Millicent accumulated a fortune of approximately $300 million through investments and business holdings that most of the family never knew about." $300 million, Amanda repeated, letting the number hang in the air like an accusation. "Money that should have been distributed among family members according to standard inheritance practices, not concentrated in the hands of one person who may not understand the complexity of managing such resources." I felt my throat tighten. "And who do you think received this inheritance?" "According to the estate documents our investigator obtained, the bulk of Millicent's assets were left to you, Catherine. Nearly $250 million in various investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business interests." The room fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had measured time during countless family gatherings where my inadequacies had been discussed with similar gravity. "Now, we understand this comes as a shock," Mom said, her voice taking on the tone she'd used when I was a child who needed complicated situations explained in simple terms. "We know you're probably feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility, confused about what this means, maybe even frightened about how to handle such a large amount of money." "Which is why we're here to help," Amanda added. "We want to work together as a family to make sure these assets are managed responsibly and distributed fairly among the people who were closest to Millicent." Dad pulled out another document, this one clearly prepared by a law firm. "We've consulted with the state attorneys about the best way to handle this situation. Given the size of the inheritance and the complexity of managing such diverse assets, we believe the most prudent approach is to establish a family trust that would be administered by people with relevant expertise." "People like Amanda," Mom clarified, "who has experience with financial law and estate planning, and your father, who's been managing investments and business finances for 30 years. Amanda's smile was practiced and professional. "Catherine, we're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to protect you from making mistakes that could have devastating consequences. Most people who inherit large sums without proper guidance end up losing significant portions of their wealth through poor investment decisions or financial mismanagement. We're also concerned about the tax implications. An inheritance of this size comes with complex federal and state tax obligations that requires sophisticated planning to minimize the burden on all family members." I looked around the room at the 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, who were supposed to want what was best for me regardless of personal cost. Instead, I saw calculating expressions, carefully prepared arguments, and the kind of coordinated strategy that suggested they'd been planning this intervention for weeks. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, though I already knew where their answer would be. "We're proposing that the inheritance be restructured as a family trust," Amanda said, pulling out what was obviously a prepared legal document. "Equal distribution among family members with professional management to ensure responsible stewardship of the assets." "Equal distribution?" "4 ways," Dad clarified. "You, Amanda, your mother, and me. Each family member would receive approximately $62 million, which is still more money than most people see in their lifetimes. And professional management? Amanda would serve as primary trustee, Mom explained, given her legal background and experience with financial matters. Your father would serve as co-trustee, providing business oversight and investment guidance. And what would my role be in this arrangement? The three of them exchanged glances that lasted a fraction of a second too long, revealing that they had anticipated this question and prepared their response.
You would be a beneficiary, Amanda said carefully, with the same rights and access to funds as the other family members. But Catherine, you have to understand that managing $250 million requires expertise that takes years to develop. Investment strategy, tax planning, legal compliance, risk management, these aren't skills that people acquire overnight. We're not questioning your intelligence or your character, Dad added quickly. We're simply acknowledging that financial management at this level is a specialized field that requires education and experience you haven't had the opportunity to develop. Mom leaned forward with the expression she'd used when I was young and had to be convinced to accept guidance I didn't want. Catherine, sweetheart, think about your track record with financial decisions. You've struggled to maintain steady employment. You've never owned property or managed significant investments. Suddenly being responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars would be overwhelming for anyone, but especially for someone without a background in financial management. We're offering to help you, Amanda said, her voice taking on the patient tone she probably used with difficult clients. We're offering to share the burden of responsibility while ensuring that you receive substantial financial benefit from Millicent's generosity. And if I refuse this generous offer? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dad's expression grew stern, the same look he'd worn when I was a teenager who'd disappointed him with poor grades or questionable decisions. Catherine, we hope you'll be reasonable about this, but if you insist on trying to manage this inheritance independently, you'll be taking risks that could affect the entire family. What kind of risks? Legal challenges to the will, Amanda said bluntly. Our research suggests that Millicent's decision-making in her final years may have been influenced by medication, illness, or diminished cognitive capacity. There are grounds for contesting an inheritance that seems to discriminate unfairly among family members. Financial instability, Mom added. If you make poor investment decisions or fall victim to people who want to take advantage of your inexperience, the entire estate could be jeopardized. Tax consequences, Dad continued. Improper handling of an inheritance this size could result in penalties and legal problems that affect everyone connected to the estate. Amanda opened another folder and pulled out what looked like a lawsuit filing. Catherine, we've already consulted with attorneys about challenging the will if necessary. We have documentation of Millicent's medical treatment in her final months, evidence of prescription medications that could have affected her judgment, and testimony from healthcare providers about her cognitive state during the period when these estate documents were executed. Are you threatening to sue me? We're trying to avoid legal action by resolving this within the family, Mom said, her voice taking on a wounded tone. But Catherine, you have to understand that allowing one family member to control such vast resources while others receive minimal inheritance isn't fair to anyone involved. Especially when that family member has a history of financial instability and poor decision-making, Dad added, his patience clearly wearing thin. The words hit like physical blows. Financial instability, poor decision-making, a history of failure that made me unworthy of trust or respect. After 27 years of disappointing them, I was finally being offered something they wanted, and their solution was to take it away from me for my protection. There's one more thing you need to consider, Amanda said, her voice growing cold. If you force us to challenge this inheritance in court, the legal fees will come out of the estate itself. That means everyone gets less money in the end, including you. Much better to handle this privately as a family with everyone's best interests in mind. I sat in my childhood living room surrounded by people who were supposed to love me, listening to them outline their strategy for taking away the one thing that might finally prove I was worth believing in.
They'd spent months preparing this intervention, gathering evidence, consulting lawyers, developing arguments that painted my inheritance as a mistake that needed to be corrected by people with better judgment. But what they didn't know was that I'd already claimed the inheritance. I'd already spoken with Harrison Thorne and understood my legal standing. I'd already read Millicent's letter explaining exactly why she'd chosen me over them. Most importantly, I'd already discovered that someone had believed in me completely, had trusted me with resources that could change the world if used wisely. I need time to think about this, I said, standing up from the chair where I'd been positioned like a defendant awaiting judgment. Of course, Mom said quickly. This is a lot to process, but Catherine, don't take too long to decide. The legal window for challenging the will won't stay open indefinitely. And don't discuss this with anyone outside the family. The fewer people who know about these assets, the better for everyone's security and privacy. I drove home through Thornfield's quiet streets, past houses where normal families were probably having normal dinners and discussing normal problems that didn't involve $250 million inheritances or legal threats between relatives. The conversation I'd just survived felt surreal, like something from a movie about dysfunctional wealthy families, not something that could happen to a hospital cleaner who'd been working double shifts just to pay rent.
But it had happened. My family had revealed their true feelings about my character, my competence, and my right to control my own financial destiny. They'd made it clear that their love was conditional on my willingness to accept their judgment about what I deserved and what I was capable of handling. More importantly, they'd shown me that the inheritance wasn't really about money. It was about power, control, and the fundamental question of whether they would ever see me as an equal member of the family or just someone who needed constant management and guidance. Millicent had anticipated this moment. She'd known that significant wealth would reveal family dynamics that might otherwise remain hidden beneath surface politeness and social expectations. She'd known that my parents and sister would see my inheritance as something that threatened their position as the successful, responsible family members, while I remained the struggling, dependent one. What she'd given me wasn't just money. She'd given me the opportunity to discover whether my family's love was real or whether it was just another form of control disguised as concern. Tomorrow, I would have to decide how to respond to their ultimatum. Tonight, I would have to accept that the family I'd grown up with might not be the family I needed going forward. I spent the night staring at my ceiling, replaying every word of the confrontation at my parents' house. Sleep was impossible when my mind kept cycling between anger at their deception and terror at the choice I was facing. By dawn, I understood that this wasn't really about money or inheritance law or family fairness. This was about whether I would spend the rest of my life allowing other people to make decisions for me based on their assessment of my inadequacies. At 6 a.m., I called Evelyn Cross. "I need to see you," I said when she answered on the second ring. "They made their move last night, and I need advice before I respond." "Come for breakfast," she said without hesitation. "We have a lot to discuss." An hour later, I sat in Evelyn's sunlit kitchen, surrounded by the smell of fresh coffee and homemade scones, recounting every detail of the family meeting. Evelyn listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more serious as I described their coordinated strategy. "They've been planning this for months," she said when I finished. "The private investigator, the legal consultations, even the timing of last night's meeting. None of that was spontaneous. They knew exactly what they were going to say and how they were going to pressure you." "What should I do?" Evelyn poured more coffee and studied me carefully. "Catherine, before we discuss strategy, I need you to answer an honest question. What do you want your life to look like 5 years from now?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't understand." "Do you want to be Catherine Rivers, who honored Millicent's wishes and used her inheritance to build something meaningful?
Or do you want to be Catherine Rivers, who gave in to family pressure and spent the rest of her life wondering what might have been possible if she'd had the courage to stand up for herself? But they're threatening to destroy me in court. They have lawyers, evidence, medical records that could prove Millicent wasn't competent when she made the will. Catherine, let me tell you something about contested inheritance cases. They're expensive, emotionally devastating, and very difficult to win when the estate planning was as thorough as Millicent's. Your family's attorneys are probably telling them they have a reasonable chance of success, but attorneys make money from litigation whether they win or lose. Evelyn pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. I took the liberty of consulting with my own legal counsel after our conversation yesterday. Margaret Sinclair at Blackwood and Associates specializes in inheritance disputes and estate law. She reviewed Millicent's will and the trust documents, and her assessment is that your family's case is much weaker than they probably believe. What did she find? Millicent's medical records show no evidence of cognitive impairment during the period when she executed these documents. She was examined by 3 different physicians in the months before her death, and all of them documented normal mental function despite her physical decline. Her medications were carefully managed, and none of them were psychoactive drugs that could affect judgment. But Amanda said they had evidence of diminished capacity. They probably have evidence that she was elderly and ill, which isn't the same thing as mentally incompetent. Courts set a very high bar for overturning wills based on capacity challenges, especially when the testator worked with experienced attorneys and underwent psychological evaluation as part of the estate planning process. Evelyn opened the folder I hadn't seen before. I took the liberty of consulting with my own legal counsel after our conversation yesterday. Margaret Sinclair at Blackwood and Associates specializes in inheritance disputes and estate law. She reviewed Millicent's will and the trust documents, and her assessment is that your family's case is much weaker than they probably believe. What did she find? Millicent's medical records show no evidence of cognitive impairment during the period when she executed these documents. She was examined by 3 different physicians in the months before her death, and all of them documented normal mental function despite her physical decline. Her medications were carefully managed, and none of them were psychoactive drugs that could affect judgment. But Amanda said they had evidence of diminished capacity. They probably have evidence that she was elderly and ill, which isn't the same thing as mentally incompetent. Courts set a very high bar for overturning wills based on capacity challenges, especially when the testator worked with experienced attorneys and underwent psychological evaluation as part of the estate planning process. Evelyn opened the folder to reveal additional documents. There's something else your family doesn't know. Millicent underwent formal competency evaluation 6 months before her death, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of challenge they're threatening. She scored in the 95th percentile for cognitive function in her age group. She planned for this too? Millicent planned for everything. She anticipated that family members might question her judgment, so she created an evidentiary record that would be very difficult to challenge in court. She also structured the inheritance in ways that provide additional legal protection. What kinds of protection? The trust document includes what's called a no contest clause. Any family member who challenges the will automatically forfeits whatever inheritance they did receive. Your parents would lose the house and its contents. Amanda would lose her $5 million trust fund. I stared at the documents, trying to process what Evelyn was telling me. So, if they sue me, they could end up with nothing?
Exactly, which suggests that their threats are primarily psychological warfare, designed to pressure you into compliance. They're hoping you'll be so frightened by the prospect of litigation that you'll agree to their terms without forcing them to actually follow through. But they seemed so confident last night. Of course they did. They've convinced themselves that they're the responsible family members who deserve to control these assets. They've spent months building a narrative where you're the incompetent daughter who needs their protection and guidance. But Catherine, narratives aren't the same as legal reality. Evelyn closed the folder and looked at me directly. You have a choice to make, and it's not really about money. It's about whether you're going to let other people define your worth and capabilities for the rest of your life. What do you mean? I mean that your family's opposition to this inheritance reveals something fundamental about how they see you. They believe you're not smart enough, responsible enough, or mature enough to manage your own financial affairs. They believe they know better than you do what you need and what you deserve. The words hit like physical blows because they articulated something I'd felt but never fully understood. My family's love had always been conditional on my willingness to accept their assessment of my limitations. But what if they're right? I asked. What if I'm not capable of handling this kind of responsibility? What if I make terrible mistakes and prove that they were right to doubt me? Catherine, you've been making your own decisions about work, housing, education, and relationships for almost a decade. You've supported yourself financially, maintained employment despite difficult circumstances, and demonstrated integrity in situations where other people might have taken shortcuts. What evidence do you have that you're incompetent to make financial decisions? I've never managed large amounts of money. Neither had Millicent when she inherited her father's estate. Neither do most lottery winners or people who receive large inheritances. The difference is that you have something most of them lack, understanding of what money actually costs, because you've had to work for every dollar you've earned. Evelyn stood and walked to the window that overlooked her garden. Catherine, I'm going to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. Your family's assessment of your capabilities isn't based on objective evidence. It's based on their need to maintain a family dynamic where they're the successful ones and you're the one who requires their guidance and support. What do you mean? I mean that acknowledging your competence threatens their position as the people who know what's best for you. If you're capable of managing a massive inheritance responsibly, what does that say about all the times they've dismissed your judgment or overruled your decisions? The truth of what she was saying settled over me like cold water. My family had invested decades in seeing me as someone who needed their help and guidance. My sudden financial independence didn't just threaten their access to money. It threatened their understanding of family roles and power dynamics. There's something else you need to consider, Evelyn continued. If you give in to their demands now, this won't be the last time they pressure you to accept their judgment over your own. The family trust they're proposing would give them control over your access to funds for the rest of your life. What do you mean? Read the fine print of their proposal. As trustees, Amanda and your father would have discretionary authority over distributions to beneficiaries. That means they could decide when and how much money you receive based on their assessment of your needs and their approval of your choices. The implications were staggering. They could cut me off if they disapproved of my decisions. They could reduce your access to funds if they decided you were being financially irresponsible, making poor life choices, or failing to follow their guidance about how to live your life. You'd be trading a $250 million inheritance for a $62 million allowance that comes with permanent parental supervision. I thought about my sister's controlling personality, my father's rigid ideas about appropriate behavior, my mother's constant disappointment in my choices. The idea of giving them veto power over my financial decisions for the rest of my life was almost as terrifying as the prospect of managing the inheritance alone. Catherine, I want you to consider something, Evelyn said, returning to her seat. What do you think Millicent would want you to do in this situation? I thought about the letter Millicent had written, her observations about my character, her belief that I could handle responsibility that others couldn't. She'd want me to honor her wishes and trust my own judgment, even if it means losing your family. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't extinguish. Was I prepared to choose financial independence over family relationships? Was Millicent's inheritance worth the price of permanent estrangement from the people who'd raised me? Evelyn, can I ask you something personal? Of course.
When you stood up to your own family about your inheritance 40 years ago, was it worth it? Do you regret choosing money over family harmony? She was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful and sad. Catherine, I didn't choose money over family. I chose self-respect over manipulation. I chose independence over control. I chose to honor someone who had believed in me over people who wanted to use my compliance to validate their own sense of superiority. And your family?
Some relationships ended permanently. Others evolved into something healthier based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. The family members who truly loved me eventually accepted my decision and found ways to maintain relationships that didn't require me to surrender my autonomy.
And the ones who didn't?
The ones who didn't were never really family in the sense that mattered. They were people who wanted to control me and use my resources for their own benefit. Losing those relationships was painful, but it was also liberating. Evelyn reached across the table and took my hand. Catherine, you're facing the same choice I faced 4 decades ago. You can preserve family relationships by accepting their assessment of your inadequacies and surrendering control over your own life, or you can honor the faith that Millicent placed in you and discover what you're capable of when you stop trying to earn approval from people who've already decided you're not worth believing in.
What if I choose independence and discover that they were right about me? What if I prove that I really am incompetent to handle this kind of responsibility?
Then you'll learn from your mistakes and make better decisions going forward. That's what competent adults do, Catherine. They don't avoid making decisions because they might be wrong. They make the best decisions they can with the information they have and adjust course when necessary. I stared at my coffee cup, trying to imagine what my life would look like if I chose to fight my family's demands. Legal battles, possible estrangement, years of second-guessing every financial decision I made. But I also tried to imagine what my life would look like if I gave in to their pressure. Permanent supervision, constant questioning of my judgment, a lifetime of proving that I deserved whatever access to funds they chose to provide. There's one more thing to consider, Evelyn said gently. This inheritance isn't just about you. Millicent accumulated this wealth because she believed it could be used to solve problems and help people who needed assistance. If you allow your family to control these resources, what guarantee do you have that they'll use the money for purposes Millicent would have supported?
What do you mean?
I mean that Amanda's $5 million trust fund is structured to provide her with luxury and comfort, not to fund charitable work or community improvement. Your parents are planning to use their portion for retirement security and lifestyle enhancement. None of them have ever shown interest in philanthropy or social responsibility. The weight of that observation settled over me like a heavy coat. Millicent hadn't just trusted me with money. She'd trusted me with a mission to use resources for purposes larger than personal gratification. If I surrendered control to family members who saw wealth as an opportunity for consumption rather than contribution, I'd be betraying more than just Millicent's wishes. I'd be betraying the communities and causes that could benefit from strategic philanthropy. I need to call my family, I said, standing up from the kitchen table. I need to tell them my decision before I lose my nerve.
Are you sure you're ready?
I'm sure I'll never be more ready than I am right now. If I wait, I'll just find more reasons to doubt myself and more ways to rationalize giving in to their demands. Evelyn walked me to the front door and embraced me with the warmth I'd always wished for from my own mother. Catherine, whatever happens with your family, remember that you're not alone. There are people who believe in you, people who will support your decisions, people who understand that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make others feel more important. As I drove home to make the most important phone call of my life, I realized that the choice I was facing wasn't really impossible at all. It was difficult, painful, and fraught with consequences I couldn't fully predict, but it wasn't impossible. Millicent had made her choice when she decided to trust me with her legacy. Now it was time for me to make mine. I called Amanda first, knowing she would be the most difficult to face, and wanting to get the hardest conversation out of the way. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which was probably for the best, since it gave me a chance to deliver my message without interruption or immediate pushback.
Amanda, it's Catherine. I've made my decision about the inheritance, and I wanted you to hear it from me directly before you learn it from anyone else. I'm keeping Millicent's bequest as she intended it. I won't be agreeing to restructure it as a family trust, and I won't be signing over any portion of the assets to other family members. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but it's my final decision. I paused, trying to find words that might soften the blow without compromising my position. I hope we can find a way to maintain our relationship despite this disagreement, but I understand if you need time to process what this means for our family dynamics. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. The second call was to my parents' house. Dad answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the cautious tone of someone who suspected bad news was coming. "Catherine, we weren't expecting to hear from you so soon. Have you had time to think about our discussion last night?" "I have, Dad. That's why I'm calling. I've decided to keep the inheritance as Millicent intended it. I won't be agreeing to the family trust arrangement or redistributing the assets among family members."
The silence that followed lasted so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled but edged with anger. "Catherine, I hope you understand what you're choosing. You're choosing money over family. You're choosing to ignore the wisdom and guidance of people who love you and want what's best for you. I'm choosing to honor Millicent's wishes and trust my own judgment about what I'm capable of handling." "Your judgment?" His voice rose slightly. "Catherine, your judgment has led to a series of failed jobs, financial instability, and an inability to build any kind of meaningful career or life plan. What evidence do you have that your judgment about managing hundreds of millions of dollars will be any better than your judgment about everything else?" The words stung because they echoed doubts I'd carried for years, but they also crystallized something important. My father's assessment of my failures was based on his definition of success, not on any objective measure of my character or capabilities. "Dad, I understand you don't have faith in my abilities. I understand you think I'm making a mistake. But this is my decision to make, and I'm making it." "Then you're making it alone," he said, his voice turning cold. "Don't expect support from this family when your poor choices lead to consequences you can't handle. Don't come running to us when you discover that managing wealth requires skills and knowledge you don't possess." "I won't," I said quietly. "And Dad, there's something else you should know. If you follow through with your threat to contest the will, you'll forfeit the house and its contents that Millicent left to you and Mom. The will includes a no-contest clause that automatically disinherits anyone who challenges its provisions." Another long silence, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Are you threatening us now?" "I'm informing you of legal facts you should know before you make decisions that could leave you with nothing. Your attorneys should have explained this to you when they reviewed the will." "Catherine, let me be very clear about something. If you proceed with this selfish course of action, you will be choosing to destroy this family. You will be choosing to prioritize money over the people who raised you, supported you, and loved you despite your failures and disappointments." "And let me be very clear about something too, Dad. If maintaining family relationships requires me to surrender my autonomy and accept your control over my financial decisions for the rest of my life, then those relationships were never based on love in the first place." "Put your mother on the phone," I continued before he could respond. "Catherine?" Mom's voice was shaky, emotional in a way that made me feel like I was torturing someone who'd only ever wanted what was best for me. "Hi, Mom. I wanted to explain my decision to you personally. Sweetheart, please reconsider. Please think about what this means for our family. Amanda has children to provide for. Your father and I are approaching retirement age with limited savings. We're not asking you to give us money we haven't earned. We're asking you to share resources that none of us expected and that could benefit everyone." "Mom, Millicent left Amanda $5 million in a trust fund. She left you and Dad the house and its contents, which are worth several $100,000. She didn't leave you nothing. She left you what she believed you could handle responsibly."
But Catherine, honey, what are you going to do with that much money? You don't have experience with investments or business management. You don't have advisors or support systems in place. You could lose everything through inexperience or bad advice from people who want to take advantage of you. Then I'll learn. I'll make mistakes and figure out how to do better. That's what adults do, Mom. They take responsibility for their decisions and deal with the consequences. But why take unnecessary risks when you could have the security of family guidance and support? Because the price of that security is giving up my right to make my own choices. Because accepting your guidance means accepting your assessment that I'm not competent to manage my own life. Mom was crying now, soft sobs that made my chest ache with guilt and regret. I just severed relationships with the 3 people who'd been constants in my life since childhood. I'd chosen financial independence over family harmony, personal autonomy over the security of belonging to people who claimed to love me despite my inadequacies. But I had also chosen to honor the faith that Millicent had placed in me. I'd chosen to trust my own judgment over other people's doubts. I chose to discover what I might be capable of when I stopped trying to earn approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth believing in.
The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of relief and terror. I called in sick to work again, knowing I needed time to process what I'd done and plan what came next. I also knew that my days as a hospital cleaner were numbered. Not because I was too good for the work, but because I now had resources to pursue opportunities that aligned better with my interests and abilities. Around 3 o'clock, my phone started buzzing with text messages. Amanda had obviously listened to my voicemail and coordinated a response with our parents. The messages escalated from disappointment to anger to outright hostility over the course of several hours. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Amanda wrote. "Don't expect family support when this blows up in your face." "We gave you every opportunity to do the right thing," Dad texted. "You chose greed over family loyalty." "I don't know who you've become," Mom added. "The daughter I raised would never put money before family relationships." By evening, the messages had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt more ominous than their anger. I suspected they were consulting with their attorneys, exploring options for challenging the wills despite the no contest clause, or developing strategies for pressuring me through social or community connections. I called Evelyn to update her on the day's conversations. "How do you feel?" she asked after I'd recounted the phone calls and text messages. "Terrified, guilty, relieved, angry. Like I just jumped off a cliff and I'm not sure if there's water at the bottom or rocks." That sounds about right for someone who just chose independence over dependence. "Catherine, the next few weeks are going to be difficult. Your family will probably escalate their pressure tactics. They may try to turn other relatives against you, spread stories about your selfishness or incompetence, or find other ways to make you doubt your decision. What should I do? Remember why you made this choice. Remember what Millicent saw in you that convinced you were worthy of this trust. And start building the support systems you'll need to manage your new responsibilities." What kinds of support systems? Financial advisors who understand philanthropic giving, attorneys who specialize in estate management and family disputes, accountants who can help you navigate the tax implications of large-scale wealth, and personally, people who support your growth rather than trying to control your choices. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment and tried to imagine what my life would look like 6 months from now. I could afford to live anywhere, do anything, support any cause that aligned with my values. I could go back to school, start a business, travel the world, or dedicate myself to solving problems that mattered to me. But I could also make catastrophic mistakes that would validate every doubt my family had ever expressed about my judgment. I could fall victim to people who wanted to exploit my inexperience or manipulate my desire to prove myself worthy of Millicent's trust. The inheritance came with freedom, but it also came with responsibility and risk.
The question was whether I had the courage to embrace both without allowing fear of failure to paralyze me or drive me back to the safety of accepting other people's control over my choices. At midnight, I made a decision that felt both practical and symbolic. I wrote out my resignation letter from the hospital, effective in 2 weeks. I would finish my current commitments and train my replacement, but I would not continue cleaning floors when I had the resources to pursue work that aligned better with my education and interests. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something larger. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on what I wanted to build, rather than what I was trying to escape. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing possibility over security. I was about to discover what Catherine Rivers could become when she stopped trying to earn approval from people who'd never believed she was worth approving of in the first place. The process would probably be messy, occasionally painful, and filled with mistakes I couldn't anticipate. But it would be mine. My choices, my mistakes, my learning, my growth, my life. Millicent had given me more than money. She'd given me permission to trust myself. Tomorrow, I would start figuring out what to do with that gift. 2 weeks after resigning from the hospital, I walked into the offices of Meridian Financial Advisory Services for my first meeting as a client rather than someone seeking charity. The marble lobby and brass fixtures no longer intimidated me. They represented institutions I could now afford to utilize, rather than places where I didn't belong. Harrison Thorne had recommended the firm specifically for their experience with high-net-worth individuals who wanted to combine wealth preservation with philanthropic impact. My appointment was with Dr. Rachel Morrison, a portfolio manager who specialized in what she called values-based investing. "Miss Rivers," she said, standing to greet me in her corner office that overlooked downtown Thornfield, "Harrison has told me quite a lot about your situation and your goals. I understand you're interested in developing both personal financial security and a structured approach to charitable giving." At 45, Dr. Morrison projected the kind of calm competence I hoped to develop myself. Her handshake was firm, her questions direct, and her assessment of my inheritance refreshingly straightforward.
Let's start with the basics, she said, opening a folder that contained preliminary analysis of Millicent's portfolio. Your great-aunt was an exceptionally sophisticated investor. This portfolio represents 60 years of careful diversification, strategic risk management, and patient long-term growth. The current value is approximately $251 million, generating annual dividends and interest of roughly $12 million. $12 million a year? In passive income? Yes. That's assuming we maintain the current investment strategy without making significant changes to the portfolio composition. Of course, you could choose to be more or less aggressive depending on your risk tolerance and growth objectives. Dr. Morrison walked me through charts and graphs that illustrated decades of steady growth, punctuated by strategic adjustments during market downturns. Millicent had weathered the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and the pandemic-related volatility by maintaining diversified holdings and avoiding emotional decision-making. What this means for you, she continued, is that you have multiple options for structuring your financial life. You could live very comfortably on the investment income alone, while preserving the principal for future generations. You could be more aggressive about both personal spending and charitable giving by utilizing a portion of the principal. Or you could focus on growth by reinvesting most of the income and living more modestly. What would you recommend? That depends on your personal goals and values. Harrison mentioned that you're interested in honoring your great-aunt's commitment to philanthropy while also establishing financial security for yourself. Is that accurate? I thought about Millicent's letter, her decades of quiet community support, and her belief that wealth should be used to solve problems rather than accumulate possessions. Yes, but I don't know how to evaluate charitable organizations or determine which causes would make the best use of donated funds.
That's exactly why firms like ours exist. We can help you develop a giving strategy that aligns with your values while ensuring that your donations have measurable impact. We can also help you establish structures like private foundations or donor-advised funds that provide tax advantages while giving you control over how your charitable dollars are distributed. Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Morrison outlined possibilities I'd never imagined. We discussed establishing a foundation focused on education and job training for people from backgrounds similar to mine. We explored funding microloans for small business development in underserved communities. We considered supporting organizations that helped people transition from low-wage service work into higher-skilled careers. I'd like to start with something smaller, I said. Something where I can see direct impact and learn how to evaluate effectiveness before committing larger amounts. Smart approach. What kinds of problems do you see in your own community that might benefit from strategic funding? I thought about my years working at the hospital, the conversations I'd overheard in break rooms and employee parking lots. Healthcare workers in support roles, cleaning staff, food service, patient transport, they often work multiple jobs to make ends meet. Many of them are smart, capable people who could advance into higher-paying positions if they had access to education and training programs. Interesting. Are there existing programs that provide those services, or would you be looking at creating something new? Thornfield Community College has some workforce development programs, but they're limited by funding and scheduling constraints. Most of the people who could benefit from them can't afford to stop working long enough to complete training. Dr. Morrison made notes as I talked, asking questions about program design, target demographics, and measurable outcomes. By the end of our meeting, we'd outlined a pilot program that would provide scholarships, living stipends, and job placement assistance for hospital support staff who wanted to advance into higher-skilled healthcare positions. This is exactly the kind of strategic philanthropy that creates lasting impact, she said as we concluded. You're identifying a specific problem, developing a targeted solution, and creating systems for measuring effectiveness. That's sophisticated thinking for someone who's new to charitable giving. 2 days later, I met with Evelyn Cross to update her on my progress and ask for guidance about dealing with ongoing family pressure. They're not speaking to me directly, I explained, sitting in her familiar living room with tea and the comfort of someone who understood family dynamics better than most therapists. But I'm hearing from other relatives, family friends, people in the community who've obviously been given a very specific version of events. What are they saying? That I'm being selfish and irresponsible, that I've let sudden wealth go to my head by refusing to share the inheritance with family members who are closer to her and more deserving of her generosity. Evelyn sighed and set down her teacup. Character assassination disguised as concern for family values. It's a predictable strategy, but that doesn't make it less painful when you're the target. Yesterday, Mrs. Henderson from church cornered me at the grocery store to lecture me about family loyalty and Christian values. She seemed to know details about the inheritance that I certainly didn't share with her. Your family is trying to create social pressure to force you back into compliance. They want you to feel isolated and criticized until giving in to their demands seems preferable to dealing with ongoing conflict. Is it working? Evelyn studied my face carefully. How do you feel about the choices you've made? Not what other people think about them, but how you feel about them.
I considered the question seriously. Scared about making mistakes with the money, guilty about disappointing people who raised me, but also relieved that I'm finally making my own decisions instead of trying to earn approval from people who never really believed in me anyway. And the philanthropic work you're developing? Excited!
nervous about doing it right, but excited about the possibility of actually helping people instead of just complaining about problems I couldn't afford to solve. Catherine, those feelings suggest that you're growing into the role Millicent envisioned for you. The fear and nervousness are normal. They indicate that you're taking the responsibility seriously. The excitement suggests that you're discovering purposes that align with your values. But what if I fail? What if the scholarship program doesn't work? Or I make bad investment decisions? Or I prove that my family was right to doubt my judgment? Then you'll learn from those experiences and make better decisions going forward. Catherine, your family wants you to believe that making mistakes equals being incompetent. But competent people make mistakes all the time. They just learn from them instead of being paralyzed by them. That afternoon, I drove to Thornfield Community College to meet with Dr. Patricia Williams, the Director of Workforce Development Programs. I'd called ahead to explain my interest in funding educational opportunities for healthcare support workers, and she'd agreed to discuss potential collaboration. Dr. Williams was an energetic woman in her 50s who'd spent 2 decades working with adult learners from non-traditional backgrounds. Her office was filled with thank you cards from graduates who'd transitioned from service jobs into careers as medical technicians, nursing assistants, and healthcare administrators. Ms. Rivers, I have to admit, I'm curious about your interest in this particular population, she said after I'd outlined my preliminary ideas for the scholarship program. Most philanthropists focus on traditional students or high-visibility causes. What drew you to support workers in healthcare settings? Personal experience. I worked as a hospital cleaner for 2 years, and I saw how many of my colleagues were smart, dedicated people who could advance into better positions if they had access to education and training opportunities they could afford. And you want to fund those opportunities? I want to fund a comprehensive program that removes the barriers that prevent working adults from accessing education, tuition, living expenses during training periods, job placement assistance, and ongoing support to ensure program completion. Dr. Williams leaned forward, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine excitement. Miss Rivers, that kind of holistic approach could transform lives. Most programs fail because they don't address the practical realities of adult learners who have financial obligations that can't be suspended during training periods. What would it cost to pilot something like that? For a cohort of 20 students going through a 1-year medical technician program, including tuition, living stipends, books, equipment, and support services, probably around $800,000. $800,000. 6 months ago, that amount would have seemed impossibly large. Now, it represented a small fraction of my annual investment income, a manageable risk that could change 20 lives in measurable ways. I'd like to fund that pilot program, I said. When could we start? Dr. Williams stared at me for a moment, clearly processing whether I was serious about committing such a significant amount of money. Are you really prepared to fund the entire program? I'm prepared to fund it and work with you to design it properly. I want to be involved in student selection, program design, and outcome measurement. This isn't charity, it's investment in people and communities. Ms. Rivers, if you're serious about this, we could have students enrolled within 3 months. We already have a waiting list of people who've inquired about programs they couldn't afford to attend. Over the next hour, we discussed program logistics, selection criteria, and success metrics. Dr. Williams explained the challenges adult learners faced, the support systems that made the difference between completion and dropout, and the employment opportunities available for graduates in the regional healthcare system. There's one more thing I'd like to propose, I said as our meeting concluded. I'd like to require program participants to commit to mentoring future cohorts after they've established themselves in their new careers. Not just giving back financially, but sharing knowledge and support with people following similar paths. Building a community of mutual support rather than just providing individual assistance, Dr. Williams said approvingly. That's sophisticated program design, Ms. Rivers, creating sustainable impact rather than just addressing immediate needs. Driving home from the college, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I thought about myself and my capabilities.
3 weeks ago, I was a hospital cleaner who struggled to pay rent and questioned whether I was capable of managing my own life responsibly. Today, I designed and funded a comprehensive educational program that could transform 20 lives while creating a model for sustainable community impact. The transformation hadn't happened because I inherited money. It had happened because I stopped trying to earn approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth believing in anyway, and started trusting the judgment of someone who'd seen potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. That evening, I received a voicemail from Amanda that I almost deleted without listening to. But curiosity won out over self-preservation. Catherine, I heard you're throwing money around town, funding programs at the community college and making a big show of your newfound philanthropy. I hope you realize that amateur charity work isn't the same as responsible wealth management. When you lose everything because you don't understand how to preserve capital or evaluate investment opportunities, don't expect the family to bail you out. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way.
I saved the voicemail, not because it hurt to hear it, but because it reminded me of exactly what I'd chosen to walk away from. Amanda's assessment of my charitable work revealed everything I needed to know about how my family viewed the purpose of wealth and the responsibilities that came with it. Millicent had accumulated resources to solve problems and help people who needed assistance. My family saw wealth as something to be preserved and displayed rather than utilized for community benefit. That philosophical difference made our conflict about much more than money or family dynamics. It made it about fundamentally different approaches to living a meaningful life. For the first time since learning about the inheritance, I felt completely confident that I'd made the right choice. Not because the path ahead would be easy, but because it aligned with values I could respect and purposes I could pursue with integrity. I was proving myself worthy of Millicent's trust one decision at a time. 18 months after claiming my inheritance, I stood in the auditorium of Thornfield Community College, watching the first cohort of Rivers Foundation scholarship recipients walk across the stage to receive their medical technician certifications. 20 students who'd been cleaning floors, serving food, and transporting patients were now qualified for positions that would double or triple their earning potential, while providing clear pathways for further advancement. Maria Santos, a former hospital housekeeper and single mother of 3, had been hired as a radiology technician at Cedar Valley Medical Center before she'd even completed her final exams. James Mitchell, who'd spent 5 years in the hospital cafeteria, was starting his new position in the cardiac catheterization lab the following Monday. Each graduate represented proof that strategic investment in people could create transformative change in ways that traditional charity never achieved. Miss Rivers, Dr. Patricia Williams said, joining me in the back of the auditorium, I wanted you to see this before the ceremony ends. She handed me a folder containing employment statistics and follow-up surveys from the program graduates. 100% job placement rate. Average salary increase of 127%. Participant satisfaction scores that exceeded every metric we'd established for program success. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, Dr. Williams continued. These graduates aren't just earning more money. They're building careers with advancement potential, health benefits, and retirement contributions. More importantly, they're serving as mentors for the second cohort that starts next month. The second cohort had grown to 30 students, funded entirely by the first program's success and my growing confidence in the model we'd developed. We'd also received inquiries from community colleges in 3 neighboring counties about replicating the program in their regions. There's something else, Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying a note of excitement I'd learned to recognize. The hospital administration wants to meet with you about expanding the program to include nursing school scholarships. They're willing to guarantee employment for graduates and provide clinical training sites. How many students would that involve? Potentially 50 nursing students per year with a 2-year program that would cost approximately $2.8 million annually to fund completely. $2.8 million. The amount no longer seemed overwhelming.
It represented roughly 23% of my annual investment income, while leaving plenty of resources for other programs while still growing the principal through reinvestment. Schedule the meeting, I said. I want to understand their commitment level and program design before making decisions, but expanding into nursing education aligns perfectly with our mission. After the ceremony, I drove through downtown Thornfield, past the new community center that bore Millicent's name and housed 3 nonprofit organizations I'd helped establish: the Job Training Center for Displaced Workers, the Microloan Program for Small Business Development, and the Literacy Program for Adult Learners, all operated from the renovated warehouse that had been purchased and equipped with foundation funds. None of these programs carried my name or announced my involvement. Following Millicent's example, I'd chosen to create impact without seeking recognition, funding solutions while avoiding the kind of visible philanthropy that attracted fortune hunters and ego-driven board members. My phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn Cross. "Dinner tonight? I have news to share." At 75, Evelyn had become something between a mentor and a chosen family member. Someone who understood both the opportunities and the isolation that came with significant wealth. Her guidance had been invaluable during my first year of managing the inheritance, helping me navigate everything from investment strategy to social relationships in a community where everyone suddenly knew my net worth. Her house still felt like a sanctuary, the familiar warmth of old money mixed with genuine intellectual curiosity and social consciousness. Over dinner, she updated me on her own philanthropic work and shared community news that wouldn't appear in newspapers or social media. "How are things with your family?" she asked as we settled into her living room with coffee and homemade apple pie. "Complicated," I admitted. "No direct contact for over a year, but I hear things through mutual acquaintances. Dad retired early. Apparently, they invested the money from Millicent's house quite well. Amanda's firm is thriving, and she's been featured in several business publications as a rising star in estate law. And how does that make you feel?" Relieved, mostly. They're financially secure and professionally successful, which eliminates any guilt I might have felt about not sharing the inheritance. They're proving that they didn't actually need my money. They wanted control over it. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "And your mother?"
Mom sends birthday cards. Nothing personal, just generic messages that acknowledge the date without engaging in any meaningful communication. I think she's caught between loyalty to Dad and Amanda and some recognition that maybe I wasn't as incompetent as they believed. Are you open to reconciliation if they reach out? I considered the question carefully. I'm open to building new relationships based on mutual respect and acceptance of my autonomy. I'm not interested in going back to family dynamics where my decisions require their approval and my success threatens their sense of superiority. That's mature thinking. Family relationships can evolve, but they can't go backward to patterns that weren't healthy in the first place. Evelyn pulled out a manila envelope I hadn't noticed. "Catherine, there's something I've been waiting to share with you, something Millicent left for you to receive after you'd proven yourself capable of managing the inheritance responsibly." My heart jumped. Another inheritance? Not exactly. Instructions for the next phase of what she envisioned for the Rivers Foundation. I opened the envelope to find a letter dated just 2 weeks before Millicent's death, along with detailed plans for philanthropic programs that spanned decades and multiple states. "My dear Catherine, if you are reading this, it means you have successfully established yourself as a responsible steward of the resources I entrusted to you. More importantly, it means you have discovered the satisfaction that comes from using wealth to solve problems rather than accumulate possessions." The letter outlined Millicent's vision for expanding the Foundation's work beyond Thornfield, creating regional networks of educational and economic development programs that could address systemic problems rather than just local needs. She identified specific communities, researched potential partnerships, and even established preliminary funding structures for programs that could operate for decades. "Catherine, you now have a choice to make about the scope of your impact. You can continue operating at the local level, creating meaningful change in your immediate community, or you can embrace the larger vision I've outlined and work toward transformational change that could affect thousands of lives across multiple states." The plans she developed were breathtaking in their scope and sophistication.
educational programs that would create pathways from poverty to middle-class careers, business development initiatives that could revitalize struggling communities, healthcare access programs that could serve rural areas abandoned by traditional medical systems. The Foundation's current assets will continue to grow through investment returns, but to implement these larger programs, you will need to consider additional funding sources: corporate partnerships, government grants, individual donations from other philanthropists who share our values. She'd included contact information for Foundation executives, corporate social responsibility directors, and government officials who'd expressed interest in collaborative funding for exactly the kinds of programs she'd outlined. Catherine, I'm not asking you to commit to this larger vision simply because I developed it. I am asking you to consider whether your own experience with strategic philanthropy has prepared you for leadership on a scale that could address problems too large for any single foundation to solve alone. The final paragraph made me cry for the third time since learning about the inheritance. You have exceeded every expectation I had when I chose you as my heir. You have proven that character matters more than credentials, that integrity matters more than experience, that compassion combined with strategic thinking can create change that lasts generations. I am proud of who you have become and excited about who you are still becoming. I set down the letter and looked at Evelyn, who'd been watching my face as I read. She planned for this moment too, I said. Millicent planned for everything. The question is whether you're ready for the next phase of what she envisioned. I thought about the scholarship graduates I'd watched that afternoon, the programs that were already changing lives, the requests I received weekly from other communities wanting to replicate our models. I thought about the resources at my disposal and the problems that were too large for local solutions, but might yield to coordinated regional efforts. I'm ready, I said, not because I think I have all the answers, but because I've learned how to find people who do and how to support their work effectively. What's your first step? I want to visit the communities Millicent identified, meet with local leaders, understand what kinds of partnerships would be most valuable. I want to spend 6 months listening before making any commitments about program design or funding levels. Evelyn smiled with the expression of someone who'd watched a protege exceed expectations. That's exactly what Millicent hoped you would say. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Rivers Foundation's new regional headquarters in Columbus, looking out at skyline views that reminded me how far I'd traveled from my days as a hospital cleaner who questioned her own competence. The foundation now operated programs in 12 communities across 3 states. We'd funded nursing schools, trade certification programs, small business incubators, and rural healthcare clinics. Our scholarship recipients were graduating into careers that provided living wages and advancement opportunities while serving as mentors for the next generation of students. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Catherine, this is Mom. I saw the article about the foundation in the Columbus Dispatch. I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Would you be willing to have lunch sometime? Love, Patricia.